the stranger's gaze. I shouldn't have gone out for that walk. It was one of those nights where the park, typically full of life by day, transformed into something eerie under the moonlight. The air was still, unnervingly so, making every sound, my footsteps on the gravel path, the occasional rustle of leaves, feel amplified, intrusive. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was somehow trespassing, stepping into a place that wasn't meant to be disturbed after dark. The streetlights flickered weakly along the path, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched out like skeletal fingers, grasping at nothing. I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets, feeling the chill of the night settle into my bones. There was something off about the night. Something unspoken in the wind, like a low hum just beyond the range of hearing, something that tugged at the back of my mind but refused to come into focus. Ahead, the path twisted into a darker part of the park, a cluster of trees where the shadows bled together, hiding everything beneath their thick canopy. I hesitated, glancing back the way I came. I hadn't seen a soul since entering the park. There was something isolating about it, how quiet, how empty it all was. Against my better judgment, I pressed on, my feet crunching over fallen leaves and twigs that littered the path. Every step seemed to echo as if the park itself was holding its breath, waiting. The trees loomed closer, their dark branches knotting together overhead like a tangled web. As I approached, something caught my eye, a figure standing near the edge of the trees. My heart stuttered. He stood there, impossibly still, shrouded in the inky blackness that the dim light barely touched. The only clear feature was the grotesque silhouette of a gas mask, its reflective lenses catching the faintest gleam of the streetlight. A hose dangled from it, trailing down to his knees, long and rubbery, disappearing into the shadows at his feet. I stopped, breath hitching in my throat. He hadn't moved. He was just standing there like a forgotten statue. And then, without warning, his head turned sharply, the mask's dead eyes locking onto me. Even from this distance, I could feel it, a suffocating sense of being watched, scrutinized like prey caught in a predator's gaze. The air turned thick, impossible to breathe. My legs refused to move. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back the way I came, but I stood frozen, locked in place by his stare. Then, with a deliberate, almost mechanical movement, he turned away from me, stepping between the trees, vanishing into the woods as though he were nothing more than a shadow. And just like that, the silence deepened. I was alone again. Or at least I thought I was. I don't know what came over me, but the moment he disappeared into the woods, something pulled me forward. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, maybe something deeper. A whisper in the dark corners of my mind that told me I had to know more. Against every shred of common sense, I stepped off the path, my feet moving almost involuntarily. The trees swallowed me whole as I ventured further into the forest, the air growing colder, heavier with every step. It felt like the darkness was pressing in on me from all sides, thickening with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough to drown out the faint crunch of my footsteps on the dry, brittle leaves. I didn't see him, not at first, but I knew he was there, somewhere in the black. I quickened my pace, threading through the trees as quietly as I could manage, my breath shaky. The stillness of the park was gone now, replaced by an almost unnatural silence. Even the wind had ceased to stir, and the faint rustle of leaves was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Then I saw him again. Just ahead, standing between two massive oaks, the man in the gas mask. His back was to me this time, the long hose dangling like some grotesque appendage, swaying ever so slightly in the non-existent breeze. I froze, instinctively ducking behind a nearby tree, my pulse roaring in my ears. What the hell was I doing? My mind screamed at me to turn back, but something about him held me captive. His deliberate stillness, the bizarre contrast between his almost human-like form and the alien menace of that mask. He looked unnatural, wrong in a way I couldn't quite place, like a distortion in reality. I peeked out from behind the tree, my breath catching in my throat. He turned his head. Once again, those cold, reflective lenses locked onto me, seeing me despite the darkness that should have hidden me. His posture stiffened, and I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me like a physical force. My body tensed, ready to bolt, but still I remained rooted to the spot, as if something was holding me in place. Then, slowly, he turned away and walked further into the woods, vanishing once again behind the thick wall of trees. I released the breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my legs trembling beneath me. I should have left right then. I should have taken his disappearance as a warning, but instead, I found myself stepping out from my hiding place, moving deeper into the forest after him. My mind raced as I followed, slipping between the trees with growing unease. The park no longer felt familiar, no longer felt like the place I had known all my life. The deeper I went, the more disorienting it became, as though the trees themselves were shifting, reshaping the landscape into something unrecognizable. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye. There, just ahead. He was standing again, partially obscured by the twisted branches of an old, gnarled tree. His mask glinted faintly in the dark, reflecting a sliver of moonlight that cut through the canopy above. This time I stayed still, pressing myself against the rough bark of a tree, hoping he hadn't noticed me yet. My breathing was shallow, every inhale feeling like a betrayal that would give away my presence. But then, slowly, horribly, his head began to turn once more. I could see the pale reflection of his eyes behind the glass lenses, tracking me, fixing on my exact position. My blood ran cold. This time the feeling was worse, like he wasn't just watching but actively calculating, dissecting me with that lifeless stare. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like they were weighed down, the air too thick to move through. And then, just like before, he turned away without a word, walking deeper into the forest, his figure fading into the darkness. Something primal within me snapped. This was a mistake. I had to leave, had to get out of the park, get home. Every muscle in my body ached to move, to break away from this madness, but my legs had other plans. My body was betraying me. I was walking again, following him. My mind was a cacophony of panic and fear, but I couldn't stop. I had to know where he was going, what he wanted. I hurried after him, the trees thinning slightly as the forest opened up into a small clearing. Moonlight bathed the area in an eerie glow, and there, standing at the far end of the clearing, was the man in the gas mask. He stood still, facing away from me, his figure stark against the pale light. The long hose trailed from his mask, snaking along the ground like some terrible living thing, disappearing into the shadows behind him. My breath hitched as I crouched behind a low bush, watching. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to stop, to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. What was he waiting for? What was this? Suddenly he shifted. This time he didn't turn his head. He turned his entire body, the hose swinging lazily from his mask as he faced me directly. The hollow eyes of the mask stared straight through me, and for the third time that night, I felt the crushing weight of his gaze. But this time something was different. This time it felt more deliberate, like he had been expecting me. He tilted his head, just slightly, as if beckoning me to come closer. A surge of panic coursed through me. This was wrong. So wrong. But before I could act, he turned again, stepping into the tree line at the far edge of the clearing. He was going into the deeper woods. Something about the way he moved was almost inviting, like he wanted me to follow him. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the clearing. My eyes locked onto his, or at least, onto the glass lenses of the gas mask, which reflected the dim moonlight in small, haunting glimmers. We watched each other in a silence so deep that I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, steady but uneven, betraying the panic that was crawling up my spine. He didn't move. Neither did I. Time seemed to stretch. Seconds melted into minutes, and the longer we stood, the more oppressive the air became. The trees around us formed a dense wall of black, pressing in from all sides, leaving me with the unmistakable feeling that this small clearing had become its own world. Isolated. A place where things weren't governed by the same rules, where normal, rational behavior had no place. He tilted his head slightly as though scrutinizing me, and that simple motion sent a chill through my bones. His stillness was maddening, almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy and intense, as though his eyes were boring into my very soul. My mind raced, questions tumbling over one another. Who was he? Why was he here? Why the mask, the hose? But none of the answers came. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry, parched from the tension building inside me. Just when I thought the silence would crush me, he spoke. His voice cut through the air, rough and grating, like metal being dragged across concrete. Why are you here? Each word seemed to claw its way out of him, slow and deliberate, the sound muffled and distorted by the mask. The deep, abrasive tone of his voice was almost inhuman, as though he was speaking from somewhere far beyond the mask itself. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My thoughts were jumbled, caught somewhere between terror and confusion. Why was I here? I couldn't even remember what had driven me to follow him in the first place. It was like some invisible force had compelled me, pulling me deeper into the forest without any regard for reason. He took a step forward, the hose attached to his mask dragging along the ground behind him, coiling like a snake. "You shouldn't have followed," he rasped, his voice sharp and heavy with a warning I couldn't quite understand. His words, slow as they were, felt deliberate, filled with meaning I wasn't meant to grasp. The air around us grew colder. The moonlight seemed to dim, as if the very world was pulling away, leaving just the two of us in this shrinking bubble of reality. My body was frozen in place, caught between the overwhelming urge to flee and the strange, insistent pull to stay, to hear what he had to say next. But he didn't speak again. He just stared. We stood there, our eyes locked, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me like an unbearable burden. There was no movement, no sound, just the two of us suspended in that timeless moment. His eyes, or what I imagined were his eyes, hidden behind the dark lenses of the mask, seemed to drill into me as if he was searching for something, some unspoken truth. The longer it went on, the more unbearable it became, as though he was peeling back the layers of my mind, exposing every fear, every insecurity. Then without warning he spoke again. "You are not ready?" I flinched at the words, confused by their meaning. Not ready? Ready for what? Before I could ask, before I could even process what he had said, he stepped closer and I could see his face now, or at least the contours of the mask clearer than before. The rubber hose that dangled from his mask swayed slightly, brushing the ground with a soft hiss, and a low, steady sound of his breathing filled the silence. It was mechanical, heavy like a machine struggling for air. Then suddenly he stopped. The breath I had been holding escaped in a shallow gasp, and I forced myself to speak. Who are you?" I managed to stammer out, my voice sounding small, insignificant against the oppressive stillness of the night. He didn't answer. He just stood there staring at me through the soulless eyes of the mask. His head tilted ever so slightly, as if he was considering something, weighing some invisible decision in his mind. And then, without a sound, he disappeared. One moment he was there, solid and terrifying, and the next, he simply faded into the darkness as though the very night itself had swallowed him whole. I blinked, startled, my heart pounding in my chest. Where had he gone? But before I could process what had happened, a sudden, blinding light exploded in front of me. It wasn't the soft glow of the moon or the faint light of the stars. It was intense, brilliant, like staring directly into the sun. My vision went white, and a sharp pain shot through my skull, as though the light was piercing into my mind. I stumbled backward, my hands flying up to shield my eyes, but it was too late. The light was everywhere, consuming me, flooding every corner of my consciousness. The world around me dissolved into that brilliant, blinding light, and with it, my awareness faded. I awoke in my bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My sheets were tangled around me, soaked through, and my heart was hammering in my chest as though I had just run a marathon. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Everything felt disjointed, as if I had been torn from one world and thrust into another. It took a few seconds for reality to settle back in, for my room to take shape around me. The familiar outlines of my furniture, the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the window, it was all there, but something still felt off. My skin tingled with unease, and a cold dread settled into the pit of my stomach. Slowly, cautiously, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my knees weak and shaky. The dream, if that's what it had been, was still fresh in my mind. The man, the mask, the light, it all felt so real. I could still hear the rasp of his voice in my ears, still see the gleam of the moonlight on his lenses. I moved toward the window, my breath catching in my throat as I peered outside. The street below was empty, silent, just as it always was at this hour. But something drew my gaze, pulled my attention to the far end of the street, near the tree line. And then I saw him. Standing in the shadows, just barely visible in the dim light, was the man in the gas mask. His figure was unmistakable, the long hose dangling from his mask, trailing down to his knees. He was watching me, just like before, his eyes hidden behind the dark, reflective lenses, staring up at my window. My blood ran cold.